"This town ain't big enough for both of us," is an expression commonly attributed to Wild West gunslingers. But rather than a critique of mid-19th century American urban planning, this statement expresses a common sentiment. Big personalities can generate friction when they bump up against one another. The same principle can also apply to nations, and nowhere is this more clearly illustrated than during the Cold War. With the defeat of the Axis powers and the end of the Second World War in 1945, the world bore witness to the emergence of the two superpowers that would come to define the remainder of the 20th century, the United States of America and the Soviet Union. Despite their wartime alliance, the two were ideological opposites, with the USA espousing the merits of free market capitalism and the Soviet Union trumpeting communism as the universal truth. Naturally, the two became rivals. Great power rivalries are a common occurrence in history, but one crucial development meant that the two nations couldn't just duke it out on the battlefield, as was the usual custom. The advent of the atomic age. On August 6, 1945, the United States demonstrated to the world that they possessed a weapon of unimaginable power by reducing the Japanese city of Hiroshima to ruins with a single atomic bomb. A follow-up attack on the city of Nagasaki on August 9th proved that the USA could replicate their new superweapon, prompting the Empire of Japan's surrender on August 15th. The USA enjoyed nuclear hegemony until August 29th, 1949, when the Soviet Union successfully detonated their first atomic weapon, RDS-1, kickstarting a race between the superpowers to stockpile increasingly powerful nuclear weapons and diverse ways of delivering them. The result of this nuclear proliferation was a great standoff between the nations comprising the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, and the Eastern Bloc, made up of the Soviet Union and its various allies and subjects. But, despite a few close calls, there never would be a war between NATO and the Eastern Bloc. At least, not in the traditional sense of the word. The destruction wrought upon Hiroshima and Nagasaki had mortified the world, and started the so-called nuclear taboo, which still stands to this day. Armed conflict between NATO and the Eastern Bloc could very easily, perhaps inevitably, escalate into a nuclear war, which could not be countenanced. However, neither side were willing to sacrifice global influence, or the chance to see their chosen ideology reign triumphant, and thus a different sort of conflict emerged, one waged primarily by spies, demagogues, diplomats, scientists, and proxy insurgents, what we now call the Cold War. I'm James, and I'd like to welcome you to the first instalment of my Tales from the Cold War series, where we will look at peculiar stories from this most unconventional of conflicts. Mutually assured destruction, also known as MAD doctrine, holds that a full-scale nuclear confrontation would inevitably result in the total destruction of both the attacker and the defender. The launch of a nuclear salvo by the United States, for instance, no matter how sudden, would be detected and responded to instantly with a return volley by the Soviet Union, destroying both nations, a lose-lose scenario. The logic of this doctrine is at the core of why the Cold War remained, well, cold, and why, thankfully, we live in a mostly non-irradiated world. But this didn't mean that either side wouldn't try to tip the equation. Before the widespread deployment of intercontinental ballistic missiles, nuclear-armed submarines, and early warning satellites, it was believed by military strategists that victory could be achieved in a nuclear conflict through a devastating and unexpected first strike, decapitating the enemy's command structure and destroying their nuclear launch sites before retaliatory strikes could be launched. This was, no doubt, on the mind of the Soviets when, in 1961, they learned that the US had stationed 15 PGM-19 Jupiter nuclear-armed ballistic missiles in Turkey. In addition to acting as a deterrent, these missiles could theoretically allow the US to launch a devastating first strike on the Soviet Union, preventing the latter from retaliating. In response, the Soviets famously attempted to deploy ballistic missiles in Cuba in 1962. Right on the USA's proverbial doorstep, leading to a standoff which nearly escalated into a full nuclear exchange, before both sides agreed to remove their missiles from each other's borders. But these plans didn't end with Cuba. In 1960, 1 year prior to the US's deployment of ballistic missiles in Turkey, representatives from the United States Department of Defense met with officials from the Danish government. The Danes were informed that the United States had begun construction of a military base in Greenland the year prior. This wasn't exactly novel. The US already had a military base on the cold and largely inhospitable island, Thule Air Base, which was built in 1951 after the signing of the Defense of Greenland Agreement, which granted the United States exclusive jurisdiction over defense areas within Greenland. Named Camp Century, this new base was the brainchild of Colonel John Kerkering and Captain Thomas Evans of the United States Army. When famed CBS reporter Walter Cronkite travelled to Greenland to visit Camp Century in 1961, Captain Evans personally informed Cronkite of the camp's purpose. Well, there are really three objectives. The first one is to test out the number of promising new concepts of polar construction, and the second one is to provide a really practical field test of this new nuclear plant. And finally, we're building Camp Century to provide a good base here, in the interior of Greenland, where the scientists can carry on their R&D activities. Although Cronkite later admitted to finding his accommodation at Camp Century claustrophobia-inducing, he and his many millions of viewers were impressed by the so-called city under the ice. There was, however, a secret purpose to Camp Century, one which would not be revealed to the public until 1997. See, Camp Century was to sit atop a 2,500-mile-long network of tunnels hidden beneath the Greenland ice cap, connecting 2,100 launch silos over a 52,000-square-mile radius. Traversing these tunnels would be up to 600 nuclear-armed Iceman variant LGM-30 Minuteman intercontinental ballistic missiles, ready to launch at a moment's notice. Quite an audacious plan. Well, the US were worried by the prospect of a decapitating nuclear first strike by the Soviets, and were racking their brains trying to come up with countermeasures. Camp Century was designed to fill this role. By shuttling missiles to and from the numerous launch sites beneath the ice cap, the Soviets would have no way of identifying where missile launches were likely to come from, essentially making a US retaliatory strike inevitable in the event of a Soviet nuclear attack. This project was named Project Iceworm, a surprisingly descriptive name as far as these clandestine operations go. By 1963, 21 large trenches had been dug, covering a distance of 1.9 miles. These trenches were capped with arched roofs, and prefabricated buildings were then assembled within them. These included a hospital, a theatre, a convenience store, an infirmary and emergency operating theatre, a post exchange, and a chapel. Just like home. Within these tunnels lived 200 US military personnel in fairly comfortable conditions. Surprisingly, the US remained quite willing to have members of the public poke around Camp Century. In addition to Cronkite's 1961 visit, journalists from National Geographic and the New York Times were invited to visit Camp Century, and a competition was even held in both the US and Denmark, allowing Boy Scouts the opportunity to visit the site. The two winners, Kent Goering of Neodesha, Kansas, and Soren Gregersen of Korsør, Denmark, were awarded the role of junior scientific aide, and spent 5 months between October 1960 and February 1961 at Camp Century, assisting the Army engineers in their non-secret tasks. Gregersen enjoyed himself so much that he actually returned to Camp Century for 2 consecutive summers, going on to become a geophysicist later in life. In fairness, the cover story, as told to Cronkite, wasn't a total lie. Camp Century's semi-mobile PM-2A nuclear reactor was actually a remarkable achievement in nuclear engineering, and military scientists from the Cold Regions Research and Engineering Laboratory did conduct useful experiments at the camp. For example, 3 ice core samples were taken in Camp Century, with one drill reaching the base of the Greenland ice sheet for the first time in history, allowing scientists to examine the climates of the distant past by analysing air trapped within the ice. To the general public, Camp Century offered a look into a self-contained society in an extraordinarily hostile environment, a glimpse at possible habitats that could be built on the Moon, or Mars. After all, the space race was well underway by this point, and had captured the imagination of the public. Cronkite summed it up well. Men will stay behind here, in their city under the ice, to continue man's battle against nature. He has brought his greatest scientific achievement, power from the atom, to the very top of the world. But can he live here? Can he stop the crushing force of the ageless ice? Though an impressive effort was made, the answer to Cronkite's question would ultimately be no. From the very outset, Camp Sentry was bedeviled by unforeseen problems. In a 1965 technical report, Lieutenant Colonel Elmer F. Clark, the former commander of the U.S. Army Engineer Arctic Task Force and the Greenland R&D program, recorded that numerous major alterations had to be made to the original base plan during Camp Sentry's construction due to, among other things, snowdrift accumulation, time constraints brought on by the dark Arctic winters, poor ventilation, and excessive heat buildup. This heat buildup would become a major problem for Camp Sentry. Clark reports that the heat generated by the nuclear reactor, electrics, and people within the camp was causing the trenches dug into the ice to deform rapidly, writing, "The temperature of the adjacent snow mass has risen several degrees. As a result, the snow has deformed more rapidly than predicted by several fold." By the time this report was published, Project Iceworm had already been abandoned, likely in 1963, prompted by fears of tunnel collapse. The PM-2A reactor had been disassembled and removed from Camp Sentry in the summer of 1964, with cost-cutting measures cited for this decision. While the report is generally positive about the camp's overall construction and concludes that the methods and techniques employed in the construction of Camp Sentry have been determined to be feasible and fundamentally sound, other discoveries would prove fatal to the project. By 1965, geologists working at Camp Sentry had discovered that the Greenland ice sheet was moving at a rate faster than the Department of Defense had initially calculated. It was originally estimated that the tunnels would have to be redug every 5 years, as stated in Clark's report, but this discovery reduced that time down to 2 years, possibly less. Coupled with the aforementioned heat issues, major structural problems would have to be constantly addressed inside the camp and associated tunnels, causing the overall costs of the project to spiral. By 1966, Camp Sentry was completely evacuated, after only 6 years in operation. The death blow for any future plans to revive Project Iceworm, or station nuclear weapons in Greenland, was delivered in 1968, when a US Air Force B-52 bomber flying over Greenland and armed with 4 B-28FI thermonuclear bombs crashed near Thule Air Base. Though an accidental nuclear detonation was avoided, the area surrounding the crash site was contaminated with radioactive materials, greatly alarming the Danish government, who had initially granted an exception to Greenland in Denmark's 1957 nuclear-free policy, though this exception was unknown to the Danish public at the time. The subsequent embarrassment led the Danish government to amend the Greenland Agreement on 31st of May 1968, explicitly prohibiting the stationing or transport of nuclear weapons on or above Greenland. This wasn't too much of a disappointment to the US, as recent developments such as the introduction of the Minuteman II ICBM in 1965 and the success of the Skipjack class of nuclear submarines would grant the US the second strike capabilities that they sought. The existence of Project Iceworm remained a secret for decades after the closure of Camp Sentry, but in July 1995, when Danish Minister of Foreign Affairs Niels Petersen issued a public statement claiming that Greenland had never hosted American nuclear weapons, he was sent a confidential letter by a representative of the United States government, informing him that the US did indeed station nuclear weapons in Thule Air Base between February 1958 and the summer of 1965, something that pre-1968 Danish governments had generally presumed. Parts of this letter remain classified, but he was probably informed about Project Iceworm as well at some point, as a Danish parliamentary investigation in 1997 was able to publicly reveal the existence of the project to the world. After the camp was decommissioned, it was believed by the US military that the remains of Camp Sentry would be safely entombed within the polar ice forever. But as with so many hopeful predictions of that era, climate change has other plans. In their paper, The Abandoned Ice Sheet Base at Camp Sentry, Greenland in a Warming Climate, a group of researchers led by William Colgan of York University in Toronto observed that net ablation would guarantee the eventual remobilization of physical, chemical, biological, and radiological wastes abandoned at the site. A transition to net ablation at Camp Sentry would make the eventual coastward remobilization of abandoned wastes inevitable. Put simply, if the ice burying Camp Sentry begins to melt at a rate greater than the accumulation of new ice and snow, contaminated meltwater would carry this waste far beyond the bounds of the camp, causing further contamination. Though it does not appear that any nuclear weapons were ever stationed at Camp Century, there is a non-negligible amount of nuclear waste buried there, thanks to the camp's portable reactor. Though the impact of potential nuclear contamination is projected to be less than that of the 1968 crash at Thule, this is still alarming. Furthermore, over 200,000 litres of diesel fuel and 240,000 litres of wastewater are believed to remain buried under Camp Century, which could result in significant environmental contamination should they become mobile, and this is looking increasingly likely. Thankfully, Camp Century is located inland, and this accumulation to ablation balance hasn't yet tipped over. But Greenland has shed an average of 270 billion metric tons of ice per year since 2003, and the ice sheet is rapidly losing mass. According to Colgan, at our current rate of global warming, net ablation at Camp Century is inevitable within the next few decades, and by 2090, exposure will be irreversible. Alarming stuff, and yet another addition to the pile of upcoming climate-related issues. But on a more positive note, I hope you've enjoyed today's episode. I've been getting into the history of espionage a lot more recently, and reading a lot of great books, and I'm having a blast with this channel, so thank you all for watching, please do like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time.